Hi, this is Steve Addison for the Movements Podcast, the podcast for people who want to multiply disciples and churches everywhere. Today we're talking to Ross Ramsey in Dallas, Texas. We're going to hear how God changes a leader's heart and the impact that has on a local church.
About 4 years ago, 4 years ago, my pastor was just kind of frustrated with us not reaching our community. And so, like any staff member, I was just starting to look through stuff. You know, I was desperate, I guess, in some sense. And then one day I was on Facebook, and a friend of mine named Jeff Crick, who's a physician in Jacksonville, had a buddy of his named Troy Cooper come up and do a training in Jacksonville. And I was just looking at some of the pictures, and they were baptizing somebody like within a day or two. And I just thought, what is this? And so I called them that day, I think just to absolve my conscience, just to find out what it was. And he began to describe to me this training. And again, I was very cynical and jaded, didn't think much of it. And so he pointed me to Troy Cooper, and Troy Cooper kind of pushed me off. He was really nice, but he said, you need to talk to this guy named Ray Vaughn. So I talked to Ray Vaughn, and Ray could only talk to me on Friday at 7 a.m. And I talked to Ray, and I really didn't understand what Ray was talking about. Training, and, I'm like, I don't want any more training. And then Ray kind of I lost contact with him. Long story short, I got back with Troy, and Troy put me in contact with a guy named Don Waybright at Sugar Creek. And he talked to me for a while and sent me an email with about what they're doing. And in that email, there was two names. One was Jeff Sundell, and the other was Kyle Pearson. And I just kind of ignored it. But I called Kyle Pearson immediately. About a day or two later, I called Kyle Pearson, and I said, hey, you're apparently doing this training in this area. I just thought he was like a rep or something. I had no idea who No Place Left was. I didn't know anything about movement. It didn't even cross my mind. Long story short, I met with Kyle, and
why did you keep going, Ross? What?
I don't know. I think I was just trying to be polite and just follow up with these things, but I had nothing else, and this was what keeps kicking. It was kicking at my door, and I felt like, okay, I just have a natural curious mind, and I just want to see what it was so I could check my box off. But what was really interesting was I met with Kyle, and I called him, and he immediately picked up the phone. And I told him who I was. And he said, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, well, nothing. And he goes, why don't you meet me at Panera Bread on 121? And I said, I know right where it is, right down the road from my house. So I met him. And he was there with Aaron Perbanik. And we start talking, and I'm real jaded. I'm just like, whatever. About 2 minutes into our conversation, their phones go off, and it's 10:02. And they go, do you mind if we pray? And I was like, well, yeah, sure. I'm not against prayer. I mean, you gotta be pretty carnal to vote against that. And they pray Luke 10:02, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he, and I thought, oh, that was kind of cute. Didn't think much of it. And so long story short, they show me the 4 fields. Makes no sense to me. I just wanted to get out of there. And before I left, though, I mentioned an apartment complex that had asked us to come in and do some stuff. And he goes, you got an apartment complex wanting you to come in and do something? I said, yeah. So he's like, what are you doing next Wednesday? I go, next Tuesday. I said, I don't know. He goes, I'll be at your church at 1:00. And just being nice, I said, okay, fine. And so long story short, that week, I looked back at that email that Don Waybright had sent to me. And there was a name in there named Jeff Sundell. And I looked at that and I go, I know that name from somewhere. And so I pulled out my prayer journal that I had kept since 2000. And I ran into Jeff in 2000, him and Angie at Southeastern, and they gave me a prayer card with their 3 kids. I mean, and all the kids are babies or whatever, really small. And he said, would you pray for me? And I've been praying for Jeff for about, at that point, 16, 17 years every week, never knowing I would ever run into him again. And so I immediately called him and go, I called him. I said, hey, I just met with Kyle Pearson and all this. And he said, well, I'll be in Plano on Friday. So I met with Jeff on Friday, met with Kyle that Tuesday, met with Jeff Sundell on Friday. And I'm sitting there. I hadn't seen Jeff in, 17 years at that point, 1999 or 16. And I sit down and I'm sitting there waiting for him in the hotel. And he comes in and he's got this big beard. He's just, I was like, I don't know about that. He looked mean. And I just like, hey, are you Jeff? And he's like, yeah, you Ross? I said, yeah, I just want to meet you. I've been praying for you every day or every week for 16, 17 years. I just want to, what are you doing? So he sits me down and begins to school me. And I don't know. And I'm sitting there and he's got his whiteboard out and he's drawing all this stuff. And all I can tell you is I know this sounds like hyperbole, but it was like Jeff stopped talking and God started. And it just resonated with me. And I just was like, oh my goodness, this is so incredible. It's like, where have you been my whole life? It was about an hour, 45 minutes. And I look up and Kumar is sitting across from me. He's in town. Chuck Wood is sitting across from me. Angie Sendell, and Chuck Wood's wife was there. Aaron, and all these people were around me, and I had no idea. I was just so engrossed in what Jeff was doing. And it was at that moment I knew this is what I had to do the rest of my life.
Wow.
What was interesting was when I called Kyle and Aaron had been trying to find a church in Dallas that would lock onto these principles. And they couldn't find one. So they started fasting and praying for a week. At the end of that fast and prayer, I called them. And again, I didn't. And so that's where it really started for me. And then from that point on, Kyle started training me. And then just a series of God-like stories. I eventually said, I've got to take this to my church. I can't keep it in my, I was kind of embarrassed because I was knocking on doors and no one does that. I mean, that's like Jehovah's Witnesses and crazy people. And so I was kind of embarrassed about what I was doing, but I was seeing really neat things. And so my hand was kind of forced. And eventually I took it to our leadership of our church. And that was about 3.5 years ago, end of 16. So 2000, almost 4 years ago. And, it just exploded when I took it to the lay people and began to train them. And it just mushroomed out from there. It just became bigger than anything I could have ever imagined. So just kind of there's a lot of other details, but that's just kind of the beginning, how it started here.
So really God found you. You know, persistent, multiple contacts, the breakthrough didn't come initially, but you just kept pursuing it. But in another sense, God kept connecting you with the right people.
Yeah, there was no question. There were, I would say, sovereign relationships that God had. I mean, I really look at it. I look back on it, and I see Him pursuing me with this. And there were several key moments. There was one key moment. We came back from the harvest, me and Kyle, and we had knocked on several doors and had several really great conversations. And he asked me a question. At the time, I resented it. He said, Ross, how often do you work? How many hours a week do you work in the church? And I said, well, 40 to 50, crazy week 50, normal week 40, 45. And he looked at me and goes, And he goes, you get paid full time? And I said, yeah, I do. Benefits? I'm like, yeah, it's one of those gigs. And he said, how much of that time do you give to pursuing lostness? And I went, what? Out of 40 hours a week? I said, well, I call visitors and stuff. And he's like, no. How much time do you give to pursuing lostness? And I thought, you punk. You don't have a clue what you're talking about. You don't work in a church. You don't have a clue what you're talking about. But I could not get that question. It just sat in my crawl. And I thought, I'm getting paid by a church and I don't pursue lostness. And it occurred to me at that point that I could answer my own Lord's Prayer in Luke chapter 10, verse 2. I couldn't be a laborer that was sent in the harvest, and I was getting paid. And that's that's when, for me, something clicked that I got to do this if no one else does. And I'm so glad I did, because I found out that there's a lot of people in our church, in our community, who are waiting for me to lead in this regard. But initially, I just wouldn't. But God eventually forced my hand on some things.
So, how are you changing as a person?
Are you kidding? It's rewritten me. It's rewritten my my hunger for God. It's rewritten my marriage, my parenting. It's crazy how when you get on mission, all these other things begin to change about your life. It's not like you get on mission and then you work on your marriage and you work on your parenting and then you work on your money and then you work on your purity. Mission is, for me, is like a shotgun. And my intimacy, my prayer life, everything changed. And it gave me a greater hunger for all those things that I didn't have before. And I think part and parcel of that is because I became desperate for God. The harvest does that to you. When you're out there pursuing lostness, you really begin to see how badly you have to abide to do it. And so I kind of backed into abiding by getting on mission.
And so this shift is going on within you, and you're out with Kyle in the harvest. You're changing. How did you take what was happening in you and introduce it into the life of the church?
So, and that's a great point. This is probably where I struggle the most, even to this day, because so what happened was I was doing it, and I didn't tell anybody. I told my wife and my assistant that I was going out in the afternoon with some guy to, Anyway, well, I felt like God was telling me, you need to take this to your pastor and your leadership at church. And I go, no, I'm not. I'm embarrassed. I'm not going to do it. Then one Sunday morning, this is crazy. This is how God just kicks the door in if you don't. One Sunday morning, we pray with our staff, and my pastor looks up at me, and he begins to tell the story about Sugar Creek. And we had a guy from our church that morning who was speaking. He was from Sugar Creek. He was doing some financial thing. And my pastor took him out to dinner the night before. And this guy starts to describe 3 circles, knocking on doors, follow-ups, all the kind of the 4 fields. And so my pastor's like, oh my goodness, this is phenomenal what you're talking about. He comes back to me on Sunday morning, and he begins to describe to me what I'm doing. And I haven't said a word to him about it.
Wow.
And he looks at me and he goes, Ross, I want you to look into this. And I mean, I was speechless. I just was like, what? And it was like the hair in the back of my head stood on end. And I couldn't even say anything like, I'm doing this. I just sat there, and it was like, God's like, if you ain't going to get him, if you're not going to take this to your leadership, I'm going to get the leadership to take it to you. And I immediately went back into my office, called my wife and go, you won't believe this. You know that stuff I've been doing? By this time I had told her. I go, Chad has asked me to look into it, my pastor. She goes, Ross, if God isn't telling you. And it was from that point forward that I pretty much put my foot on the gas. And that Monday morning, I went into his office and I told him, I said, Chad, you know what you described? I've been doing it for the last month, and I just never told you. And he kind of went, okay. I don't know if he ever connected the dots. I don't think we ever really talked about it. And from that point forward, I said, I'm going to bring this to the leadership of the church. And he said, great. And so I set a meeting for 3 weeks later on a Sunday night, and I invited every single person I could. And me and Kyle got up and described what we were doing and set a training date for about a month later and invited everybody we could.
And what was the response to the training?
Well, what was interesting was, so that meeting was on a Sunday night. There was about 65 people there. I got up there and I began to tell them what I've been doing and what we were planning on doing. And all I can tell you is I was drenched in sweat. The anxiety was so overwhelming. And so we get up there, me and Kyle kind of share what we've been doing for the last month, knocking on doors, and how we had some follow-up and we had a couple salvations. And so we finish, and there's crickets. I mean, not a soul. I mean, everyone just sat there and looked at us like, so what? And I thought, okay, my job, I think I lost my job here. And there's this lady named Louise Phillips, who's 85 years old. Now she's almost 90. And she raised her hand. And she said, Ross, may I say something? I said, by all means. She goes, Ross, for several years now, I want to say almost 30 years now, she says, I've been praying that God would bring something to this church that would help us to break into this community. And she goes, I think this is it.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, thank you, Lord. Well, that next day, my pastor calls me into the office. He goes, that was an interesting meeting. And I said, yeah. He goes, Ross, anytime Louise Phillips speaks, it's a good meeting. And I was like, well, good. So we did the training almost 3 weeks later and had 45 people there. And it was another day where it was another turning point in this, where I just took a step of obedience. I put it on the calendar and I invited everybody I could to it. And so to answer your question, we had the training in the morning. Again, I'm nervous again. I'm drenched in sweat. I don't believe it. And we model what we're going to do. We send all these people out into the harvest. I didn't tell anybody we were going to do that. That was kind of a bait and switch. I don't know whether I should have done that or not, but I did it. So 1 o'clock comes around. We break them into groups of 3. And I could tell there was a tension in the room. It was palatable. And they were angry. They're like, these were VPs, super, North Dallas is kind of a white collar area. And so we went out, and I'll end here in just a second. We went out for an hour and a half, 30 minutes. I came back early, and into the room where we were training, and no one was there. I'm thinking, everyone went home. I'm in trouble. And I sat in the front of the room, and one by one, the teams came in of 3, and they were laughing. They were crying. They were just, you could tell there was this energy about it. And they came in, and within about 5 minutes, there was about 5 people deep lined up wanting to tell me what just happened. And I said, hold on a second. I said, let's just all tell these stories together. So one by one, we had about 17 teams. There was about 45 of us, 17 or 15 teams of 3 or something like that. And each team had a significant story. In fact, a Muslim girl got saved that day. It was a part of our church for several months and ended up going to another group. But people were weeping, they were crying, and it was like a Acts type 2 awe that came in the room. And it was a day that changed my life, and it changed the direction of our church.
And what's come out of that? How has it developed since that time?
Oh man, that's been really interesting. So that was the first training, and to be honest with you, it had taken so much out of me. This is going to sound like a real paradox or a contradiction. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad I did that. But man, I don't want to do that again. That just wore me out. But I knew I had to do it again. Well, what happened was that was on a Saturday, okay? And several of the teams went back into the apartment complex that evening to follow up with people. And I mean, these are people that have never, well, I'll say never, but rarely have ever shared the gospel in their own zip code. And it was just like, it was like the scales came off of their eyes. They just were like, whoa, I've got a tool. I can do this. And so that was Saturday night. Sunday, my pastor in our prayer time, again, we would pray every Sunday morning. He's like, man, you got to tell the church what happened yesterday. I said, okay. So I got up in front of the church and said, hey, we knocked on, 100 something doors. We shared the gospel, 70 times. We had 45 people hear the God, and then two or three salvations. And everyone's like, what is he talking about? And all those 45 people that we trained went back into their groups that Sunday and began to tell everybody about what they had experienced the day before. So those 45 people became, in some sense, an evangelist. And they did what I couldn't do in the 5 years prior. They did it in a matter of about an hour. They went back in their churches and they told about their experience in the harvest, and it began to change the church. And so not long after that, Kyle came to me and goes, well, you have to have a weekly harvest. I go, what? A weekly? What are you talking about? Like, you got to go back in the harvest every week. I'm like, dude, I could hardly handle taking a group out once a month. I mean, like every week. He's like, yep. So we did one Wednesday night, and it was a handful of people from the training came. We went back out, same kind of experiences. And then Kyle said, Ross, you need to open this up to us 2 nights a week. And I said, no, I don't think anyone will show up. So he goes, no, do Sunday night. I said, okay. So I opened it up Wednesday night and Sunday night. Sunday night, we had 30 people. And then it just went straight up from there. And so we go out twice a week now, and just crazy stories. That was 3 years ago. Thousands of doors, thousands of gospel shares. And now we're training about every 5 to 6 weeks. And the vast majority of the people we're training now are other churches. We'll have a training this Saturday. 63 people will be there. I would say 45 of them are from 16 to 17 different churches. So it's just expanded beyond my scope. And now we have teams that travel around the United States, lay people teams that go and train other churches, because most of the training, I'd say all the training isn't done by me anymore. I have teams that we've raised up, all lay people that go out and train different churches around the area and around the United States.
And what's been the impact in your harvest field?
So let me start. Basically, what happened here is several things. One, the training became a pipeline for leadership. It raised all kinds of leadership I never knew about. So I had now a new pipeline for leadership. So that was the first thing. All these leaders that I never knew about really began to emerge, and this was the means to it. Secondly, we started 8 groups. We started probably a dozen in the harvest, and I would say most, if not all of them, flamed out within a matter of weeks and months. It was very difficult to get momentum. So we had several, I'd say half a dozen maybe, about a dozen. And then we found bringing them to a location was a little more for sustainability. So we have now 8 groups. The big thing that really began to change in our church is how many internationals began to flow into our church. The number of foreign speaking people really began to flow into our church on an unprecedented level. And so that was something. In fact, Don told me that when they started doing this, that was one of the first things they noticed, is that the world started coming to their church. We're typically a white, pasty, looks like me. Mm-hmm. And now our church is just all kinds of different nationalities.
Okay, so you've got 8 groups out in the community that
those are on campus now.
They're on campus now.
Those meet in our building.
Okay, but you've got 8 groups that are essentially for new believers who've come out of the harvest.
Yes. So when we run into people in the harvest, we invite them into the group. Now, let me make a distinction here, at least in the States. What the biggest group that we're running into, Steve, just in terms of numbers, is people who affirm the gospel, at least verbally, who say, I know about that. I've heard about Jesus. But when we begin to drill down with them, we find out they have no discipleship, no group. And so the largest group that we're running in here in North Dallas, even with some of the internationals, is they affirm Jesus. But in a group, actually opening the Bible is unheard of. And so our biggest invite is like, well, hey, would you like to be part of a group where we're just reading the Bible and studying it and trying to find out how to follow Jesus? And that's what we did, a handful of salvations. And so what we learned was, Steve, in the past, churches do canvassing. That's not uncommon in the States. But what they do when they go out to canvass, they're always going to go knock on a door to invite people to an event or to their church. What we found is if you knock on the door and start with prayer and start with the gospel, you always get to a much more healthier conversation about church and gathering versus if you start with hey, I want you to come to my church. So what we found is if you start with the gospel, you get to a far more efficient, maybe lack of a better word, and healthier conversation about gathering in church than if you did it vice versa, if that makes any sense.
So you're not just there to recruit someone to your church, you're there to connect them with God, and to offer prayer. And the whole tone of the conversation is around their relationship with God rather than come to my church.
Exactly. And we found if you go that route, you will end up talking about church. And by the way, we don't use the word church a lot because it's got a lot of baggage in our context. So, because everybody goes to church. I mean, everybody's, and so I don't use that word intentionally. I use the word gathering or group. Now, and I say, hey, do you have a gathering or a group you're part of where you're just learning how to follow Jesus? And it's amazing how many people go, no, that never occurred to me. And I'm like, well, hey, we got a group that meets over here at 10:30, and we'd love for you to join us. And so we've multiplied several groups just based on that demographic of people that affirm the gospel, but no gathering. In terms of the city, you can kind of put it into two categories. One is people know who our church is. We have a reputation, and good, bad, or indifferent. The police department knows who we are because we've knocked on so many doors. They know who we are. They're like, oh yeah, that's First Baptist. We've had so many interactions with the police department. I'd say anywhere between, that I know, about 5 to 10. And they say every Sunday and Wednesday night, specifically Sunday night, they get all kinds of calls. And they tell the people, that's First Baptist Allen. They're just wanting to pray for you. And so the police department knows who we are. And the other thing is just how it's connected us with so many needs in our community that we would have not known of. Everybody knows who we are and what we're doing. And so it's just it's raised just the good peripheral view that we have in the community. And then other churches know about us. And so churches are sending people to us to train, and we're getting other churches to join us in our community so we can knock on every door and have no place left. So we're partnering up with other churches. In terms of the larger context of the United States, that's really just word of mouth. In fact, right before I got onto this video call or interview, I was talking to two pastors in Nashville that got word of it and want us to come up and train. And here's the thing, Steve. This is the rub right here of the four fields, at least in the Legacy Church. Every Legacy Church, if they're honest with themselves, will know they are failing at field 1 and field 2. They will acknowledge that every day and twice on Sunday. Every pastor, if you begin to drill down in field 1 and field 2, and they're like, oh yeah, we're not doing anything. And so they recognize this is a gap in their ministry. And so when you come in here and you have practical tools and you actually do something to address those two things, they don't call them field 1, field 2, but they understand those categories very clearly. It's very intuitive and it's very linear for them. So they recognize that this MPL stuff is meeting those two fields in an unprecedented way.
And field 1 and 2 is just connecting in unreached fields and sharing the gospel. They're not doing that. Most churches aren't doing that.
Yeah, well, they recognize that they don't have an entry strategy. And most of their entry strategies are only mercy driven, a backpack or a meal or cleaning up the park. And they recognize that they're high on mercy. Their entry strategies are high on mercy, low on proclamation. And they know they're not equipping their people to get back to their oikos. They know that. And when I begin to talk like this, it's like I'm reading their mail. And the thing is, that's exactly what I experienced. And so I say, hey, do you have a strategy for entering into lostness in your community? And they're like, no. And then I go, do you have a way of equipping your people with a gospel tool? And they always go back to the old tools we used back in the day, EE, evangelism, explosion, faith. And I begin to contrast those tools with what we're doing now and how those tools were great and they were good at a time, but they were very blocky. They took a long time to train. Faith took you almost 8 weeks before you could finish the gospel presentation. EE was 13. You know, the beauty of MPL is within 45 minutes, I'm out on the street. The turnover is so much. That's how you get to multiplication, is you've turned over training so quickly. And they recognize that's something they hadn't seen. That's new across the board of all the tools we've ever used in the past. Exactly what I would love to see what has happened in our church on this simple last 3 years to happen in multiple churches, to reawaken the body of Christ to their identity as an ambassador of Christ, and for millions of gospel conversations to happen that never happened before. And whatever is at the end of that, whether that's church plants, whether that's multiple discipleship, that's in God's court. But I really would love to see what we've experienced in these last 3 years to happen to other churches. And then there's a part of me, honestly, that thinks maybe I'm supposed to go overseas. I just got back from India. I was in Omnibod working with some MPL guys there, and to see how different it looks over there, and knowing that might be the trajectory for me and my family is certainly something that is always kind of out there for me.
You can get in touch with Ross Ramsey and find out more about the training that he and his teams provide. Visit movements.net, look for the link on episode 208 of the Movements podcast.